The Parable of the Frog. It is likely she did not, but she hopes she played with particular abandon at recess later that hot afternoon. I'll walk you back to school. Her dad is on the 4 to midnight shift this week, so he'd been home when she walked back for lunch. Her chest contracts. Her mind reaches for her mother, but she's washing dishes and lifting her gaze only to stare out the window at sun-bleached wheat in the field beyond the backyard. Time staggers. Her mother rinses thoroughly each dish, adjusting the faucet on and off, conserving water as she scrubs. Her daughter assumes she would have heard her husband's offer and is declining to involve herself in this business about walking to school, a thing that has never once happened over the years. Kristen hasn't been walked to school by anyone since kindergarten. Even then, it had only been 2 or 3 times. She'd navigated the big double intersection unaccompanied at 4. It was the 70s, and generally, kids got themselves to and from school. They'd moved since, up the block. Now there's only one small street to cross at the corner. No need for anyone to accompany her, and certainly not her dad. Her mom rinses the red Tupperware cup and places it in the adjacent sink to drain. Footnote: if you wonder why her mother doesn't intervene, remember, none of us knew what was coming. And even if we could have known the extent of it, choices look easy in rearview mirrors. Nothing's ever that simple, especially when it seems clear. Okay. There's no other thing to reply. Her dad, in dark brown cotton pants and a short-sleeved button-up shirt for his 4 to midnight shift, holds the screen door open. Kristen slivers past his bronzed arm, weather-beaten and strong from the year he spent building. First this new house, then the playhouse, which has failed to materialize into being a playhouse and, disappointingly, stores dog food and the push lawnmower that squeaks with embarrassment. He also built the rabbit hutch for the unfortunately red-eyed rabbits who, if they aren't separated, eat their babies and are not the sweet bunnies Kristen had hoped for. Then the insulated doghouse for Nikki, who vaults herself from the roof of the hutch to the playhouse roof to woof and pace and is not this cuddly indoor dog Kristen had hoped for. And finally, the windy deck off the back of the house, which is not the gathering place anyone had hoped for. No one does much other than lean on its railing, surveying the backyard, browning lawn and crop and railroad tracks beyond. Kristen wears shorts and a t-shirt because September has continued to be sweltering and her grade 5 classroom is stifling. What she wears is important. Sidewalks the color of bleached bone glimmer under sweltering sun, brush strokes in the concrete not yet worn by feet and bikes in this newly built area on the edge of the city, adjacent to fields and the steel mill and refinery, all 3 wafting acrid air and particulate. The asphalt street is soft, pliable, and melting underfoot, its gasoline stink melding with the parched scent of sun-withered lawns crisping. Do you want to go to heaven when you die? He glances at her as they walk, side by side, past one new neighboring house, then another, street silent in midday heavy heat. She does not, in fact. Not if heaven is anything like what his group, as her mom caustically refers to them, says it is. It sounds more like hell, Kristen thinks whenever she's at a meeting and a worker talks for an infernally long time about how joyful heaven will be, the reward for all the hard work they do on earth. She wants to go to this heaven, but hasn't figured out how to convince herself of this. She knows not to say this, though. She learned fast. Asking questions, debate, curiosity, the things her father taught her, the qualities he'd always encouraged, none of those had value anymore. How she'd learned to be was now unwelcome, banished, dismissed, and signifying only unwanted worldliness, marking her sin, marking her as wrong. Of course I do. She calibrates her tone perfectly, ensures it is definite and at the same time deferential. His query is a trap, and she knows it, but she can't think where he's going with this open-ended investigation into end-of-life and beyond concerns. It's tricky. No, it's impossible now to suss out where any conversation with him will lead. The happy thwack of her flip-flops against the sidewalk feels suddenly flippant. She works to lessen their cheerful sound as they continue up the street. A grasshopper staggers its landing in front of her. She quelches revulsion and cautiously maneuvers past. You can never be certain what a grasshopper will do next. Then you'd better start wearing dresses. He speaks so quietly, she has to work to hear as he explains about women and modesty, about clothes and what they mean, about showing the world who she is and about why she must, and then about how she will do it. His tone is modulated, but Kristen has become adept at hearing what's being repressed. She also knows this forced intimacy, this folksy walk, this light-hearted, charming chat is in fact about deeply serious matters. All are indicators she must heed the low notes, his descant providing small signals to impending tumult, to what she knows churns within her father, what is now rarely contained. He chuffs air out his nostrils. She despises this noisy exhalation, both for its snorting vibrational sound, but also for the significance it carries. He's already angry. She missed her chance. It's too late to avert what's coming. Fingers and toes numb, even as the sun scorches the part in her hair. Her heart clamors and alarm roars in her ears. There are no shadows anywhere. She notices only shimmering heat waves in the distance. They look like puddles, but they are not. Thoughts bolt, uncontrolled. Vague strategies throb even as she despairs, knowing she can't think fast enough. Her mind flutters as she wrestles control of limbs wanting to gallop, to go. Bare legs are abruptly indecent, exposed. Irritation flickers as she perceives herself suddenly naked, but she hammers back her anger, tucks it deep inside, holds it in the pit of her gut. If he even senses reticence, he'll pounce. The safety of a public street is an illusion. It won't matter. She senses her own satisfaction as she replies, I do, though, wear dresses. She sanitizes the pitch of her assertion, attempts to convey complete agreement tinged with only the faintest hint of surprise, inflection carefully applied. How could he doubt her desire to end up in heaven? Even as she speaks, she navigates alternative emphasis, inflection. I do, though. I do, though. I do, though. She'd be unable to say later just which syllable mildly marked what she hoped suggested vague wonder, knowing simply in the end, it didn't matter. I wear dresses Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She permits a hint of pride as she reminds him, although in shorts at the moment, she had already ceded to a dress more days than not. This schedule had been her private concession to the unspoken but also incredibly clear rule female 2x2s wear dresses or skirts. Modest ones, of course, not minis or denim or anything tight. After attending a few Sunday night gospel meetings, she'd asked a worker about attire. Specifically, the dresses it hadn't been difficult to notice on every woman and girl all the time. It had been Dad who encouraged her to ask. She understood later. He'd also likely been curious. She'd also later understood something else. He'd obviously been quicker to grasp a key point. Questioning 2x2 dogma was not welcome, so he dodged by abdicating and got his child to ask. The 2x2 custom at weekly Sunday night gospel meetings is for attendees to shake each other's hands before lining up single file style to exit, shaking then by turn the hands of the workers who led the meeting. Kristen had been nervous but brave. The workers were a version of Pastor Don, were they not? She'd been in Sunday school and knew putting up hands was a good thing. The worker looked at Kristen gravely before responding. Her grandmother, on her dad's side, later referred to that particular worker as Ichabod Crane. 2 dour workers had visited, likely at her son's request they share the word with his lapsed Catholic mother. No dummy, she'd apprised what was happening to her son's once blandly normal life. A dull life, but dreary in the most gorgeously deceptive way. Soothing, unpretentious days. A mildly quiet existence as years crept delicately forward. Kristen's grandma had artfully constructed her own most beautiful mundanity and looked askance at the plain-suited men in her living room. Kristen liked to picture the scene, her grandma stabbing a cigarette out before lighting another of the endless cravenness she smoked. Kristen herself had wondered if the worker's sour face could look anything like a reanimated corpse, skin hanging like a loose hide, surprisingly shallow blue eyes roomy, and appreciated her grandma's derisive nickname for him. But that was later. Now he answered Kristen's question about dresses and women in a roundabout way, which meant he didn't answer at all. She doesn't remember how long it took for her to understand questions were never answered, were instead thrown back to the asker, looped around and muddled, the opposite of an end to a maze. Ichabod soberly demanded of her instead. What kind of woman, he wondered mildly, did she think God wanted to see? What did she think people thought when they saw women dressed in worldly ways, adorning themselves with gold and jewels, painting over the faces God had created? As he spoke, he lowered the volume of his voice. Tall and reedy, he towered over her. He folded his long, fingered hands loosely, showed her what it meant to look down a person's nose. She smelled his thrift shop uniform, breathed in its gloom and melancholy. She's certain now she caught a particular waft of chosen loneliness that night, a life bare of sensation. The worker performed speculation. Perhaps, he said, and went on as though it had just occurred to him. Could she be an example to those worldly people? To the lost souls milling about, garbed in garments displaying how they'd gone astray? To the lost sheep, no shepherds to guide them? Everything the worker said that day and everything every worker said later implied this was Kristen's choice. It was everyone's choice regarding everything, from dresses versus pants to being in the world but not of it. All for her to choose over and over. With the heart of a child, she considered his words carefully. She later parsed the Bible passages with her dad, knowing now he'd been directed, where Timothy and Peter urged women toward modesty and away from adornment. Albeit disappointed, sorely disappointed, by the news that what she wore factored into heaven versus hell, although puzzled, Lutherans et al. Didn't realize women were supposed to wear dresses. Although she intuited this assessment lacked a nuance she felt but didn't know how to express, Kristen landed herself in the middle and decided she'd be that modest example 3 days a week at school. She prided herself on that decision, wearing a dress to school 3 times a week when she'd never, ever before worn a dress other than for church or formal occasions. Wearing a dress when no one wore dresses ever had been an enormous sacrifice, a huge concession to something she still secretly wasn't sure mattered to God. The God she knew, or the one she'd known anyway. The crux of it had been the positioning, this as her choice. For so long, she believed she'd done this on her own. She suffered this allegiance to modesty because she understood God demanded she must. She determined better safe than sorry, of course. Clinging to her old life, she'd worked her mind around to hold 2 things at once. A dress 3 days a week, pants or shorts twice. She hated every minute of it, to be clear, but she did it anyway. She did it because she looked in her heart, acknowledged her ugly human desire to be like her peers, comprehended this was precisely what made her flawed. She ceded to more than occasional dresses and understood her choice to be, in fact, proof of her willingness. She'd been so proudly comfortable God would understand. Gym and playing were tricky in dresses. Surely it was more modest even to sometimes wear pants. Surely, she reasoned, God understood. She explained this now. Not good enough, Dad replied. His tone was now unsanitized, in fact, more growl than speech. His daughter comprehended instantly and completely. She didn't have to glance at him to know she had only seconds, public place or not. She panicked at the prospect, on the street, in front of the neighbors. They were approaching her maternal grandparents' house. Both grandparents lived within blocks. Her lapsed Catholic grandmother lived 3 blocks away, her maternal grandparents only a few doors down from the new house, the house that had led them to the truth. Perhaps Grandma would be puttering outside, but she wasn't. nor was Grandpa in his rocker on the screened-in porch watching people wait for the bus. It was too hot. They were indoors. Kristen was alone with her father, and he was going to unpeel his mind shortly. She ceded. It was the only thing to do. Okay. That wasn't all she said. It can't have been. It would not have been enough to simply give in. Rolling back his rage would have taken gargantuan energy, and even though this rage was new, children are generally quick learners. His daughter shored him up, helped him settle. She'd never recall what she said, but as an adult can imagine. She would have demonstrated meekness, cooled his white-heated anger by not only agreeing to this modesty, but by affirming her belief in it. If she got it right, and she must have because he didn't erupt that day, what she said acted as balm on wounds she couldn't see. She agreed. Of course she did, because what else was there to do? I can do that, she would have said, forced herself to look at him as her flip-flops smacked with irritating whimsy, smiled serenely, performed absolute acquiescence, displayed total submission, ensured he understood what she understood. This was what God wanted. All right, have a good day. He turned abruptly back then at the corner, his task done. She walked the rest of the way to school alone. Years later, she wonders about that afternoon. Had she in fact anticipated those moments as the next crush of the wheel's turn? She thinks not, knows that it had been with a child's mind she interpreted her fate. Perhaps it's conceivable, although not fully, but it's conceivable she grasped what was to come, how this moment marked her own full-fledged slide, positioned now publicly as other. That day marked her, and then she marked herself, stepped over a line she hadn't till then understood must be drawn. It is likely she did not, but she hoped she played with particular abandon at recess later that hot afternoon. She hoped she swung upside down from the monkey bars, that she tumbled down the hill and laughed off its bumps. She hoped she ran and jumped and relished those last few free hours. She knows she understood what was coming on some level, but she was only 10, and she could not have, no one could have, understood how deep the fissure. She was only 10, and she was in fact lucky. She'd lived a generally nondescript life on a quiet street in a mostly unimportant city, where days tumbled forward, marked by weather, where long-established calendars indicated what came next, until something else entirely marked the days that now belonged to what Kristen understood was the truth, and the unspoken dictates of that truth. They were loud, and they were clear, crystal clear. I was the frog. We were the frogs. I wrote this piece a long time ago. It was ready to send, and then the other night I pulled out the few notebooks I've for many years schlepped around in a bin. I hadn't done much more than flip through one or two. But I found this, and I found it after long ago using the frog in boiling water story to illustrate how none of us knew what was coming. That story, one of many small allegories tumbling in my mind, apparently stems from a meeting in 1984. And rather than the warning it was intended to be, warning against the slow and certain descent into hell for those of the world, it warned me of something else entirely. I just didn't know it then. The danger? It wasn't the world. No, it wasn't the world at all. You don't know what's coming until it comes, and sometimes you can't understand what came until much, much later. When I think of my life and compare it to others' lives, I see so easily what's missing. It's tricky to do an honest assessment. People try all the time, weigh what we have against what we want, then weight those things against what others have and don't have. We slot ourselves in accordingly, more than her, less than him. Looking back, I see all the things I had. The basics were more than covered, although I truly thought we were on the brink of poverty. Now I realize it was Depression-era frugality that meant if we ate all the fruit or cereal or crackers before payday, there wouldn't be more till the next one. Material, even immaterial, I didn't lack much. The thing about looking back, using the hindsight we know colors how we frame and shape events and memories, it's unreliable. I'm never certain where I land on the usefulness of this exactly, but I'm compelled to examine the artifacts of my life, envying others who I assume trip forward easily, living in moments as they pass, unworried by what might happen and, importantly, unbothered by the past. If I could make wishes that were granted, and after I got all the general but important wishes out of the way, world peace, yada yada, I'd wish to be one of those people grounded in the moment and not in all the other spaces I find myself instead. I promised myself I'd find a way out, free myself, be happy. I thought about jobs, sure. I'd have a home and friends and a family. But mostly what I dreamed for myself was for that freedom. First to choose, and then to choose happy. The problem, however, was this. After I left, I didn't know how to be free or how to attain that elusive happiness. Happiness itself was a construct the 2x2 cult had a particular disdain for. Positioned against joy, happiness was what worldly people wanted, found in worldly pursuits. The 2x2s were after something far greater, with meaning that spanned space and time, would last for eternity. Suffering on earth? That was the point. I chased happiness, though, still do. For a long time, I chased an impossibility. I tried to find a way back to how things could have been, perhaps, what might have been, instead of what could be. And when I look back, certain moments mark themselves as harbingers, but of course, at the time, they all were. A few minutes in a day, a few more minutes in that pot of warming water.